That should be good, I think.
Does that feel better?
Yeah. So it's on the bottom, right?
So it's like...
Oh yeah, it's this.
Is that the stable?
Yeah, that
And then
feels
maybe
good.
The front there, just pull that down.
Okay. Look good? Perfect.
You're all set up?
All set, all set.
Is that your water bottle there?
That's my water bottle, yeah.
So Kusha's just going to introduce you.
Okay, great.
Welcome to the Communitech Data Hub. My name is Kusha and I work for Communitech. Welcome to our online viewers as well. So before we start, we wanted to try something new. I'd like to ask those of you who are hiring to put up your hands. Okay, that's a lot of you. And I'd like those of you who are looking for work to also put up your hands. Okay, so this is great now that you all know each other. Oh, sorry about that.
Oh.
Okay. So now that you all know each other, feel free to engage afterwards and connect. And onwards to business. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker. Mick Higgins is the CMO at Cattle, and he is here to speak today about how cognitive bias can hurt your media plan performance. Everyone, please welcome Mick.
Thanks, everyone. Great to be here today. Thanks to Communitech and the Data Hub for having Cattle and myself in to present today. Really excited to talk to you all today about cognitive bias and how it might be killing your media plan. It all comes down to really how you're optimizing and what your campaign management looks like. But today we're going to look into the whole space of programmatic campaign management, how data plays a role, and then very importantly, how bias plays a role in line with that data and how we make decisions. So first, a little bit about me. So some of you might have picked up from my accent. I'm from Ireland originally. I went to Dublin Institute of Technology. I have a Bachelor of Science in Marketing. I graduated in 2009 and moved to Canada during a pretty bad recession within Ireland. So in terms of looking for opportunity, I decided to kind of pack my bags and go to Canada, where I was able to network myself to a role in SEO at a company named Search Engine People. I learned a whole bunch there. It was a really great time to be working in SEO. You could really influence search engines and their behavior at the time. Not that you can't still, but at the time it was a little bit easier to do that. So I saw a lot of cool stuff. I saw a lot of people that were monitoring trends at the time. It was a very data-heavy practice. All my roles have been very data-centric. Funny story from there was that was around the time when Oprah had proclaimed acai, the new superfruit, acai superberry, and pretty much the entire SEO team was buying up acai berry diet, acai berry drinks, acai berry juice, and basically using those domains to generate income. So they were able to use SEO to rank for those types of high intent keywords at a key time where there was a lot of interest in that area, and then monetize that space from running AdSense. So that was kind of really interesting, where I kind of would see, oh, trends and data are like a huge part of the whole online ecosystem. And I was then recruited into Reprise Digital, where I worked in search and content. So during my time there, we actually, when I started there, it was all paid search and there was no SEO practice, so we developed that during my time there, grew that out to be a key part of the business. 5 years later, I left. I was the head of innovation at that time, and took on a really great opportunity at Direct Access Digital, another great firm here in Ontario. I see one of my former colleagues here in the audience. Big shout out to Kerry there. Thanks for coming by. And there I learned a lot more about programmatic. So I was obviously using a programmatic channel in search, and I really wanted to learn more about how the overall programmatic practice worked and how data was being used to optimize campaigns. So through the business development process there, which was my role, I was able to really understand that a lot more clearly and apply kind of my learnings to my next big opportunity, which was at Cattle, where the CEO and founder, Ransom Hawley, he recruited me to Cattle based on my interest in data, my background in marketing and optimization. And really what I've been learning there more is data and media. So here today I'm here to kind of give you a little bit of my nearly 10 years of experience in digital optimization and how you can apply some things to your teams when you leave today. So hopefully everyone gets a little something out of today. I saw the list that there's lots of engineers, lots of marketers, great kind of mix, so a very good environment for growth hacking. For anyone that's just new to Cattle or downloading the app, I apologize that our drapes don't match the carpet right now. We are mid-rebrand and we're at the mercy of Android and iOS a little bit right now, where we're still waiting for our release on the app side, but if you go to the website, you'll be able to see all of our new branding, and love to hear what anybody thinks. So in tribute to our old logo, anyone who was familiar, which was a cow head, I'll be your cow today. So this is my cow face. So we'll move on from there. So I'm not gonna talk a lot about Cattle today, but to give you an idea just about what Cattle is, we help brands to optimize customer experience using data-driven solutions. We do that by collecting data directly from the consumer through our apps on Android and iOS. We engage with consumers through surveys. They can upload pictures of receipts and watch videos, all for cash back. So we work in really that data democratization space and helping users or consumers to really get more value from the data that they're transacting on a daily basis, which when we kind of go through some of these slides, I think you'll see the alarming amount of data that we actually transact through our devices. So just to kind of level set, cognitive bias, for anyone who's anyway unfamiliar, it's really about heuristics and decision-making process. And there's over 100 cognitive biases known currently that I'm counting, which influence how what TV show we're going to watch, what type of bread we buy, what type of beer we drink. Everything here, there's a certain amount of bias in play, and based on what kind of information you're playing with. So the first thing we're going to look at is how bias is hacking our brains. So we're going to look at a couple of really key examples of where bias plays a significant role, and where, in a way, we are all kind of being hacked. So first off is our brains rely on feedback loops. So if you think about this even outside of the digital space and social approval, the number one marketing objective a lot of times still, or the number one driver of growth, is still word of mouth. Referral plays an absolutely enormous role. And pre-internet, like, where did you find out about new movies, restaurants, places to go? Word of mouth and referral was still really key, which is a driver of social approval. So we see that more in social media now, where social approval, it's like, oh, John went to this new restaurant. John has good taste in food. I should check out that restaurant. So social approval is at play all the time in our everyday lives. And what's interesting about social approval is, when you think of our devices, it's gotten to a little bit of a case for me anyway, where it's like, who works for who? Like Siri's pretty awesome. Like, I recently just switched back from Android to iOS, and I've been using Siri a lot more, and it definitely does feel, it's like, wow, you're really actually helping me in my day-to-day, like you are a real assistant less than a phone. So for anyone who's not exploring more on the voice side with Siri, I definitely highly recommend it. Some of the commands are absolutely fantastic. But to kind of add some context here, in Canada, the average Canadian spends over 24.5 hours per week on their devices. This kind of adds up to, a lot of people, the average is people are checking their phones about 300 plus times a day. There's a lot of different numbers out here for this, but even if you do a quick count mentally yourself, it's, what do you check your phone for? You check it when you get a notification, you check it when you wake up, you check it when you go to bed. Like, these numbers really stack up really quickly. And how many times in the space of 5 minutes when you're waiting on something, when you're waiting for that feedback loop, you're waiting for that text back, how often are you looking at it multiple times? It's like, why have they text back yet? It's all about social approval and really how crazy these devices have become. It's kind of insane how central they've become to our lives. I actually even recently just thought about, I was like, could I get rid of my smartphone? Like, could I just live without it? And I'm not sure I could anymore. It plays like a pretty integral role in my day-to-day, and I would end up having to change a lot of my behavior, which is really kind of plays into the variable reward side of things. So variable schedule rewards, put this into a little bit more context as well. We just talked about social approval. An example there being, you upload a picture, a new profile picture to Facebook. You're inherently interested in how many people like that photo and what kind of notifications you get. What's interesting is, and I don't know if people have noticed this or not, but Facebook, LinkedIn, any social network, they don't just alert you every time someone likes your photo. They batch them up into a number. So it's like, John and 10 people like your photo. And that's all designed to maximize the release of dopamine for you. So what's going to actually give you that? And dopamine, to put an explanation on it, really is is that little something you feel when you get something unexpected. So you weren't expecting to get that notification on, oh wow, all these people liked my photo, but inherently we're trained to really respond to that mentally. So the dopamine side of things is really important, but a lot of times we only talk about it in the context of gamification and basically, being able to build apps and experiences which release that dopamine. But it's more than that. Like, it happens in an everyday. It happens from a consumer side, and it happens in your business as well. So I just want to call that out, that it's not really just something that is purely about apps and user experiences and search and social media. It's something that it predates digital, and something that you kind of have to be conscious of when you're managing budgets which are variable, because we've moved in media from a place where a lot of it was about relationships and phone calls and booking print and TV, to now you have to manage something that is auction-based. So when it's auction-based, there's a variable price. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but I'll kind of highlight a few of the areas where you may be seeing poor performance in your campaigns and why, and what bias is at play there. But variable schedule rewards, if you think about it again, back to your phone is kind of like a slot machine. And I should have really said that. That's the original explanation of variable schedule rewards. The slot machine was something where digital is involved, but it's not online. But the reason you sit and play is because you know that at some point one of those turns is going to actually yield a higher variable reward, which is what makes it really sticky. But other examples of that is downloadable content. So who in the room here has downloaded an ebook in the last month? So that's like about half the room. Or who in the room here has bought or collected points in a game to unlock some kind of content? So I got, about, quarter of the room maybe. So, again, proving the point that this is one of the things that we kind of crave, that validation. Online gambling, another really good example. It's variable. It's very similar to the slot machine in cases, and it's very sticky. And the last one is I think one that we don't talk about enough is campaign optimization. So there is marketers all over the world sitting there, building strategies, developing everything from keyword to placement to bid strategies for how they're going to manage their budget. Which is kind of, when you take a step back, kind of crazy. We put a lot of power into, people that are very innovative, but also generally very new. And I think there's a very iterative learning cycle that happens there within optimization. And I think it actually challenges some of the biases that we have innately within us. And that's something we're going to look at in the next section. But the last part I wanted to point out to kind of build the context as well was fake news. So fake news has become kind of a word for, or word base or a phrase basically for news story I don't agree with, which I think is really obviously evident to us in a lot of ways from what we see in the news today and how divisive it can be. So here's a quick anecdotal example of a real or fictional character that may be a little bit familiar to us. But this is where confirmation bias can be really divisive. The only way to really try and solve for confirmation bias is to just practice more self-awareness and really think about and embrace a culture where self-awareness and thinking about the decisions you're making and the data you're using has a defined analytical technique. And that's what we're going to look at right now, which is cognitive bias in decision making. So this next section should really appeal to anyone that's ran an ad campaign online programmatically, like a Facebook ads or a search market or a Google AdWords campaign, or anyone who's been responsible for any kind of revenue generation. So the first one I think is really interesting, particularly to Canada, the contrast effect. So when we talk about the contrast effect, it's really about like how many times have people in the room been asked to explain why one campaign didn't perform like the other campaign? Show of hands for that, like how many times people have been asked that question? So that's half the room. So this is probably one of the most frustrating things in media, and generally in the heuristic side of things, is how quickly people will compare things that seem to be the same, but in truth really aren't. So when you're asked that question, if we take an example of you're managing a campaign for Chrysler. who have a whole different fleet of nameplates. And you're asked, well, why didn't the Chevy Cruze campaign perform like the Equinox campaign? And you say, well, like, it's a different car with a different customer. So it has a very different response. So it's really funny that so quickly our brains can try to do apples to apples when it's actually apples to oranges. And in Canada, you know, I think Ontario and Quebec is such a huge example. I don't know how many times I've sat in meetings and we always try to take what we learned in Quebec and just transpose it onto Quebec, like apply it to Quebec, and it doesn't work. And then people are like, why didn't this work? And it's, well, they're a different customer. They have a different type of culture and a different type of interest. So it's really important that we avoid contrast effect, and really when you think about campaigns or media management, how are you segmenting your campaigns and what type of reports are you looking at? Like, it's perfectly fine if you've got a business case to run a Chevy Cruze campaign that targets nationally and hits every demo, but what are you really doing with the insights, the data that's collected from that? What are you doing to drive iterative change and decision making in your plans? So contrast effect is, I think, something everyone can relate to here. The bandwagon effect is another great one I love. You know, who has been in a job here where they've been given a process and said, you know, this process is kind of, you know, we could do this faster, like we could do this better, and had gotten the response of, well, that's just how we do things. You know, like that's, yeah, there's one. There's, I'm sure he had lots of people. So that's a tough one. Like that's, you know, where you really have to take a step back and think about, how am I going to manage this situation? How am I going to be able to communicate the importance of making this change and the time it's going to save me, but not just me, but the company, and how it's going to drive better performance. So bandwagon effect is a really funny one. And you know, in sports, I think that one kicks off like there's no tomorrow. Like, I'm sure everyone has, well, maybe not here, but the banners for the Maple Leafs, I heard, have been getting prepped for the Stanley Cup already, and there's quite a bandwagon gathering there. The next one is the curse of knowledge, and this might be a little hard to read, but what this young boy is really saying to the other young boy is how to make a ristretto espresso. And he knows, and he says it's easy. He's like, oh, it's easy. You just do these, you just do this, this, and this, and bang, espresso. But the other kid has no context, so it's what? Like, how do I do that? And the curse of knowledge is, again, something that when you're moving at a fast pace, and I think something really happens in every type of organization, but if you think of growth hacking, like this can be when you're not transparent and knowledge isn't really freely shared. And you know, this is where I think Slack is a really valuable platform to keep everyone informed that needs to be informed. But you can end up having people operating with half the information. And if you've got half the information, how are you going to, like, it's very dangerous if you've got half the information and you're responsible for making the decisions on how much we're going to bid on advertising today and what placement is valuable and why. So curse of knowledge is one to really be aware of. Recency bias, we're gonna look at a little bit of a story here. So John here has just finished work and he's getting into his car. And he sees a billboard for Mr. Fox's Cookies, and he says, you know what, that sounds spot on. Like, I want to get some Fox's Cookies on the way home. So he's driving home. Before he gets to the store, just when he gets off the highway, he sees a billboard for Nutty Cookies. And he's like, oh, the cookies, yeah, I definitely want to get those cookies. That reminds me, I want to get those cookies, so I'm going to stop at the store. So he goes to the store and he has a choice between Nutty Cookies and Mr. Fox's Cookies. So can I get a show of hands for Mr. Fox's Cookies? So we got maybe 4 or 5. And a show of hands for Nutty Cookies. So way to go, everyone, Nutty Cookies. So yeah, the recency bias really proves out that what we see last, or the information that we've received last, is what's going to be most important in our decision-making process. So no matter how good Mr. Fox's Cookies was, Nutty Cookies got the right placement, and there's I've heard a number of good examples in practice of this where there's been a number of advertisers that have been, you know, hell-bent on, I need to get the first billboard on the highway all the time. I got to be the first. And everyone wants to be that first, like it's like your first or last. But it actually proves out, if you can save money, if you can find a vendor that's saying, well, my first inventory is more expensive, you say, well, how much is it to get the last inventory? Like, how much is it to be like last in line? Because I want that inventory. So that's another good one in terms of when you're strategic planning, you know, where is my placement going to be and where is it in the customer journey? Kind of plays to the last click attribution model, which I know is contentious, and people, I think you need to look at more attribution models than last click, but when it comes to recency bias, the last thing someone sees is has a significantly higher chance of being the decision than the thing that you saw first. So next, to put this, kind of wrap this all together, I wanted to look at a couple of common data traps in campaign management. So false positive is generated when you set an hypothesis, you set a test, and you want to test. So an A/B test of creative is a perfect example. And generally with A/B test, the dangerous part is you normally have supporters of A and supporters of B. And if you skew from your timeline and you decide to end the experiment early because creative A is performing better than B, then you may have suffered from a false positive. So it's always very careful. You always have to be very careful that if you're deciding to run an experiment, an A/B test editing or any type of experiment, you need to stick to the timeline and not buy into the false positive. And this is a little bit counter to kind of what we all read about growth hacking and iterative change and really quick change. But I think it's really important that if you want to make quick change, do smaller testing cycles. But continuity in your testing is really what's going to help you avoid a false positive. The contrast effect, I think we've discussed, very much in detail there. So I'll just kind of walk past that a bit quickly. But that's all about perception. It's all about how we're perceiving the size of different markets. So the Ontario Quebec one, we perceive them as similar, but in truth, they're actually very different. So it's always something to keep in mind is when you're trying to compare different metrics from different campaigns. Am I suffering from the contrast effect here? Should I really be comparing these two things, or am I just kind of going further down a rabbit hole to a dead end? And the last one is loss aversion. So loss aversion is really interesting, and it's generally explained as losses loom larger than gains for the typical person. And I think when you have this situational loss aversion, how to spot this in your campaign. So anyone that's actively managing campaigns or anyone that oversees a team that does any type of acquisition where there is campaigns and data, I think a really easy way to spot if your team or your management is suffering from loss aversion is if you just see a really flat line. If you just see a really flat trend and not a lot of changes in, let's say clicks and impressions, that for me is an indicator that there's loss aversion at play. It means that there's been a budget handed out with a timeline, and I don't want to lose, the pain of loss of me being out of market and having spent my budget before the end of the timeline is greater than the return of me capitalizing on a key moment in the market. Think of that acai berry example. Like if you were in charge of managing, acai berry smoothies and that spike came up, would you want to just keep evenly spending your dollars on a day-to-day basis, or would you want to capture more of that intent? So I think loss aversion is complex, but somewhat easy to spot in your campaigns. If they're really, really flat, then I think things have gotten complacent, and loss aversion is likely in place. And it's like, how are you briefing this out? What type of budget are you giving, and what type of direction are you giving? So it's definitely something you can course correct for. I think campaign managers inherently, you want to find people that get more pleasure from gain than pain from loss, because you want them on the trigger for your media and capitalizing on the times when there's going to be more intent in the market for you. So to kind of recap there, and what you could do tomorrow when you go back to your team or go back to your desk, if this presentation really gets you thinking, which I hope it does, is ask yourself a few questions. I recommend recording the answers, add 24 hours, and you'll likely have a more informed decision. First one is, am I reviewing all my options? So this comes down to, likely recency bias. Oh, that placement performed amazing for us. Let's just double down on that and do more of that placement. But you don't really know how much inventory that placement might have. You may have already hit diminishing returns on that publisher. So am I reviewing all my options? Is there other options that I can layer into the mix? Have we mastered this channel? And that'll speak a little bit more to the growth hacking community, where it's very much about mastering a channel and moving on to a next. So where you can suffer from bias is if you stay too attached to one channel. If that channel has maximized its return, it's time to start adding new channels. The next one is, does this decision help me meet my objective? So great example of this, I think, is, remember when people bought likes? Remember when likes was a campaign metric? And people were, they would say, well, Coke has 10,000 likes. Like I need 20,000. Like I'm Pepsi. Like I can't be behind on the like count. But what did that really do to help Pepsi or Coke meet their objective? Like nothing, I would say. Very, very little. And all you did was feed more data to Facebook to understand your customers better, while you understand them less. And then the next one is, what data did I review before making this decision? So this is another example I'd use here would be from my search background. If you're making a recommendation for increased budget, you need to make sure you've checked the search query report, number one. And the amount of times I've met with people who are like, a search query report, what's that? And I was like, well, that's all the actual words that people typed in that resulted in a click on your ad or even an impression of your ad, so you can see who clicked on what based on what query. There's placement reports for programmatic. It's really, what are the diagnostic reports that help me decide, should we be spending more, should we be spending less, is this the right customer? So that's really important. That's very more like, where are the numbers, very focused on the numbers. The next one is, are there any experts I can consult? This is like my favorite because I obviously like to talk. But yeah, experts for consultation is always a huge value, I find. The more, because ultimately subject matter experts in your category are people that are passionate about your category. So who better to talk about potential customers or the market than someone that's in that position? And you can often get in a situation where you've got two-way learning, which is always a win. It's always great when everyone's getting something out of it. The next one seems kind of obvious, but again, I think gets passed by in certain industries for sure more than others. But what do I know about my customer or end user? This is, as Cattle, we do a lot of work with consumer packaged goods companies, and the reason for that is, if you think about it, what does Pepsi or Coke really know about you compared to Air Canada or WestJet or Walmart or President's Choice? Loblaws. Like they know a lot less about you because they've focused their time over the last century on supply chain and making sure that their products are distributed in all the places where you might be. Like, you can get a Coke in Home Depot. Like, why do I need a Coke in Home Depot? But anyway, I think they've really mastered a different side of the business, and now they're trying to understand, well, how do I get closer to my customers? How do I personalize my products more? And that's where Cattle really sits, is we help them to better understand their customers and give them data in a more direct-to-consumer model. So they can personalize products and make all the moisturizers and cereals and everything that you really want, because you want that peanut flavor, you want that grape flavor. That's really where they're missing some of that data. So a lot of what I talked about is really about challenging assumptions, and like, we're going to talk about how to identify and course correct for bias with data, but what I don't want people doing here is to think that, become a flat earther and just think that everything needs to be challenged. And for anyone that's read Sapiens, like, it's really interesting how people look at the flat earth, like, basically thing, like that it might actually be a thing, which is kind of crazy. But I was reading up again on it recently after reading Sapiens and seeing that Kyrie Irving, for any NBA fans out there, is a big advocate of flat earth. And what's funny is that, I don't know if some people in the room will probably know this, but flat earthers, it's not necessarily about that they think the earth is flat. They more simply think that everything should be challenged, including facts or science. So a little, they're definitely, it's an interesting viewpoint, but it's not one that I really share. So I wouldn't want anyone to go away from today thinking that the earth is flat and everything was bullshit and I need to rethink everything that I've ever done. It's not the case. I think we just really have to think about how do we stop thinking about data like black boxes that simply just have a reach number on them. So, anyone again that's been in the programmatic space knows that these reach numbers are kind of fickle because they're based on cookies. And what does a cookie really tell you about anyone? Like, you were on this page. And they stack as well, and there's a lot of fraud involved. So cookies, I think we've gotten to the point where we've kind of outgrown cookies as a targeting and measurement. What would you call it? Information. And now we've gotten to a point where device IDs, and as I mentioned, these assistants that are following it, that are staying in our pockets, and that are becoming watches, and are probably becoming earpieces. These personal assistants are really the type of data you want to be using to understand who your ideal customer is, because with a device ID, you can resolve to a single identity. It's still anonymized, but you can find out this is this person with these demographics. You start grouping together and actually start seeing different groups of consumers and how they work, as opposed to cookies, where it's like, it's got these whole whack of cookies. Like, case in point, like Toronto homeowners, 19 million reach. I can guarantee you can probably buy that audience of 19 million reach. But do you think there's 19 million homes in Toronto? There's 19 million people even in Toronto? No. But there's probably 19 million cookies that have been pulled off realtor.ca. and a whole bunch of other different websites. So again, it's really understanding that and figuring out what decisions you're making with what data you're using in your campaign. So if that's a little bit new to you, I definitely would recommend doing a quick search for cookies versus device IDs. There's a bunch of excellent articles that seem to be popping up now that'll really just explain it to you. And then just asking the questions like, what are we using for this campaign? Are we using cookies again, or should we really start looking at something that's a little bit more closer to CRM type data? And I know for anyone that is using CRM, that's kind of the pinnacle. That's what you want to be using for optimizing your campaigns. But when you need to get more, it's where are you going for it? Are you going back to the typical cookie pools, or are you going to providers like Cattle, for example, that can help you look at different specific audiences and nurture them, which is a perfect segue, really. So you got to use feedback loops to nurture the customer experience. So in each one of these cases, there's a couple of examples of what you can do to nurture them. It's really just getting those into your DMP or your DSP. For anyone that's not familiar with that, your data management platform, and how you basically activate your data. So there's lots of ways you can do it. The first part starts with segmentation and then looking at A/B testing, so feed creative, optimize where you can, observe growth and identify patterns is obviously very key. So it's really important that you look and you don't just, when you have a campaign that's performing poorly, or in this case an audience, that you don't just say, well, this is a terrible CPA, we should just abandon this. It's important to try and understand why. Like, why is this a laggard? Like, why are we not getting, why isn't this performing like this other campaign? The contrast effect, right? But it really comes down to that it's different people. So when you look at that, it's if they are important to you, you shouldn't abandon targeting an audience that you believe is high value just because the cost per acquisition is high. That means that there's an opportunity for optimization. If you actually really feel that this customer, struggling techies, is really going to be a key part of your business, you really have to work to nurture it. And I don't really think you can do that with cookies. So to kind of wrap up, really important to set standards for data and culture. It starts with integrity. So know the process, know the source, know the opt-in process, know their compliance level, know how they collect the data, ask questions about their methodology. And then next is your process. So how are you setting hypotheses? How are you defining experiments and KPIs? What data are you collecting for your own feedback loops? Because programmatic, any type of online advertising is really just a feedback loop. It's something that you are getting as you are then getting that feedback loop. So how are you doing that? What kind of time are you allowing for analysis? What do your sprints look like? What does that kind of time period look like where you're trying to develop the insights from the experiment? And then what's going to be the activation, the recommendation? So really just what is your iterative cycle, and are you sticking to it? Because it's very easy to abandon your cycle when there's a big shiny thing, like likes, like I mentioned. Like you can just, I got to go there. Why? I just have to be there. Everyone's there. So transparency would be the next one. So visualize successes and failures. We use a whole bunch of different technologies at Cattle. Fabric is one that we use, and just one example here for how we visualize successes and failures. It's a dashboard which helps us understand our retention rates, our churn, our LTV, and how we're able to celebrate those successes, but also celebrate the failures, because with the failures comes the learnings. And like I said, if that's not the right customer for us, then that learning is excellent. It means that we can then optimize our resources and invest more into new potential customers, or maximize our return on a customer that we don't feel like we've hit diminishing returns on. The last one is really important, and I think we hear a lot about this now and how important it is to not just millennials, but I think all of us in terms of our work life and culture. Allow assumptions to be challenged. Like if you want to have data as a key part of your business, you have to be prepared to have assumptions be challenged. At Cattle, one thing we love is Slack for that. I think it provides a very transparent, open medium for staff to be able to express themselves. We define our channels, so we set our channels up based on what types of conversations we want to have in them. So everything from basic articles, which is just an innovation funnel, so share everything that was of interest to you, to more product-related channels, and even something that's very important to us is customer experience. So we have a subset channel, which is really just about anything relating to innovation in the customer experience, because that's what we really care about. So to give you a quick kind of snap case study of how you can challenge your assumptions with Cattle and personalize customer experience for programmatic, I'll give you a really quick example of something we did with our client Cadreon, who's a programmatic ad tech firm under the Interpublic Group umbrella. But they had a client who had an objective of, I want to drive more customers to my patio. It's summertime, I'm not making enough money for my patio, I need to get more customers there. And their opinion was, how I'm going to get them there is with drink specials. I'm going to do Corona buckets for like 10 bucks. People are going to fly in, and my patio is going to be bumping. It's going to be the best patio in town. So the issue was the media agency and the programmatic team had a slightly different opinion in terms of what was important and what was going to actually drive them, what was going to help them accomplish their objective. So one thing that they felt was uncovered was food specials, the driver of food in terms of decision making to actually go to a restaurant or a patio, and also the ambience. So where am I going? Like, what's the scene going to look like? Within casual dining, this has become a really big thing. It's like, how Instagrammable is my restaurant? And that's a key driver, and it is really important because it creates a viral loop, right? Like, so that's something that they are very concerned with, but intuitively they believe, it's a hot day, drinks. Why wouldn't I do drinks? So we said, okay, great. And this was in the space of a week, we were able to build the hypothesis out, test it, and provide back the segments for targeting through LiveRamp. So they were actually able to activate on this. But the criteria we tested consumers on for summer patio destination, there was a list of 10 variables. And when we ranked them out, the top 3 actually remained the top 3, which is kind of logical when you think about the experience: drink specials, food specials, and ambience. How they were perceived was that drink specials would be number 1, food second, and ambience was less important. So value was number 1, basically. What we actually were able to find out through doing some really quick research on the cattle panel, which is a 70,000 plus monthly active panel. We have over 270,000 subscribed members with, as I mentioned, 70 to 75,000 active every month. So what that means is we can really drive a very rapid feedback loop. So we test the criteria consumers use when deciding on a summer patio destination. Food specials actually was the number 1 driver, so they were able to optimize their creative, optimize their campaign to put food in the forefront rather than drinks. And then ambience. So again, another great input into creative is like, what should that look like? What kind of our creative should look like? But also just a great piece of feedback as a business is, oh wow, like customers really care about ambience and experience. Next year or this year, depending on what your timelines are, we should look at ambience and how we can improve something, how we can actually build a whole campaign around ambience, because it's making up 22% of the response here. So huge opportunity to be able to grow there. So in terms of activation, it means right message, right consumer. So through LiveRamp, we're able to distribute directly to your DMP, DSP. We do all the segmentation where you can look at your loyal customers, your out-of-market customers, your competitive customers, and start really nurturing those customer experiences that I mentioned. So closing summary for me, a couple of things. So I think it's really important to develop data integrity policies internally. So know your stuff on privacy policy, GDPR, what's coming in Canada, PIPEDA, what you're currently using for data on your campaigns. Are you literally just using Facebook audiences, which are largely based on clicks and bid and clickstream data? Or are you looking at more custom data? Largely, you want to be really looking at your CRM data if you have it as a key point of influence. Second is develop a repeatable analytical technique. So I mentioned we use Trello, and this is a lot about Kanban, using a repeatable process. Very much probably appeals to a lot of the engineers in the room, but just making sure that you're getting those cycles and you're sticking to them, and you're getting consistent data back based on consistent methodology for your testing. The next is recognize key assumptions, allow them to be challenged. I can't really say that enough. I think we looked at a whole bunch of biases there, from conformational to recency bias, and how many of those really just reverberate around us doing what we know and doing what we're comfortable with. That's not how you grow. You don't grow by doing things that you're comfortable doing. You grow by setting out what your assumptions are and allowing them to be challenged and really driving a culture for innovation. Last part, kind of hand in hand, so practice self-awareness, avoid the bandwagon effect, and really look at infinite learning. So there's lots of help out there in terms of books. These are a couple of key reference points that influenced this presentation for me. Not particularly light reading. A lot of these are pick up, think about it, put it back down. Wow, and then you kind of go back to it. So if you enjoy that type of reading, it's really great. The first one I'd like to call out in particular, which is a Michael Lewis book. Anyone that saw The Blind Side or The Big Short, he's the same writer. He's got an amazing way of storytelling for very complex information, and his general jam is that he likes to look at market inefficiencies. So that's why you see like The Big Short, you see Flash Boys. He has a whole bunch of books that are about market inefficiencies, and gives a really good grounding in data. So the folks of that book is Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who won the Nobel Prize for their work on heuristics in judgment and decision making. So they basically discovered cognitive bias. Huge influence, obviously.
You can actually throw it, and you can actually catch it. It's not that dangerous. So we'll open the floor to some questions.
Thanks for the talk. So I'm curious to see, all the hype these days is about personalization or segmentation of one. And I'm curious to see where some of the things that you described, do they apply directly to personalization, or is that a different approach altogether?
No, I think a lot of it can be applied directly to personalization, because personalization inherently is filled with bias. So I have a pretty good example of this actually, where I recently started attending a lot more experience-based, tribal marketing company events. So a good example of that are the boutique fitness industry. So they're very much into building, tribal instincts. They're very much about developing a real ideal customer and getting as many of those customers as possible. So recently I went to a Soul Cycle class, which I don't know if anyone's familiar with, but it's pretty awesome. But it's basically like a mix between X Factor and spinning, which is kind of crazy, but it's definitely a great workout. I highly recommend it, but it's definitely tailored to a very specific audience. I'm not part of that audience, which is reflected in almost everything that is in the studio. It's very much tailored towards women. The size of the men's changing room is probably more of a business decision, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think the Soul Cycle example is pretty apt. You know, that's a business that's very focused on a specific type of customer and building that tribalism among that group. But typically, we're talking about businesses where you're looking to, if you think of the cloud, right? Like the cloud business is trying to communicate with everyone and trying to bring everybody in. So they have to look at all types of segmentation and tailor products. So I think it all depends on your business, right? If your business is a very clear focus, you may end up in situations where, like Soul Cycle, I'd imagine if they saw more males, they would launch a male Soul Cycle. Like they would launch like some kind of, you know, spin-off brand to cater to that audience. Which is again, I think the things you find out in your campaign management. So when you have a laggard where you're like, I really thought Gen Z was really going to like my new app, and they don't. Is that really about the branding and the advertising, or is it about the experience? So is it as simple as if I just change the colors and put up a different name and a different brand, had a different brand, they would engage with me? Or is it a case that my experience is not in line with their expectations?
So in your steps, would that happen after you've gone through a campaign and you're doing a post-mortem on a campaign, or would this analysis take place upfront before you start the campaign? Right?
So I think that comes down to your assumptions, right? So I think it's always important that you, when you're making assumptions, you do make an assumption about who the ideal customer is. So who's the priority customer and who's the secondary customer? You can go a lot deeper depending on what your resources are, but I think you always have to have primary and secondary, and allocate resources accordingly. And if you find that you have either more opportunity in terms of budget, like I have more money to spend, you can add a third customer. But yeah, the balance is tough because you're really talking about you have to get all of the worlds working together. And that's where I think growth hacking is such a phenomenal kind of subculture that's growing now, because it's combining. It's not just putting marketers off and saying, use the technology that's out there. Here's some SaaS. It's saying, here's SaaS and here's a bunch of engineers as well. Can you guys start working together and make all this stuff work exceptionally better? So I think that's, for anyone that hasn't had an opportunity to work alongside an engineer in a more growth hacking model, like it'll change your life. It's amazing. Anybody else?
Can I just throw it back to you?
Oh, good toss.
Any other questions? No? Okay. So thank you, Mick, for
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
phenomenal presentation, and thank you to our audience for attending and to our online viewers as well. We do have some extra time, so if you want to stick around and network, you're always welcome.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.